It's great to welcome Finn Brunton to the program today, who's an associate professor in media, culture, and communication at New York University. So great to talk to you, Finn.
Thank you so much for having me, David.
So I want to eventually talk about some of the different sort of money-related movements that are going on right now. You have some countries increasingly going cashless. You have cryptocurrency and all of that movement entails. But to go back a little bit, there may be a lot of people in our audience who don't know sort of the history of non-physical cash payments. When I think
Mm.
about that, I first think of sort of like credit that was kept on a ledger was the first form of like a non-cash payment. But how should we sort of conceive of that?
That's a really good way of looking at it, actually. We tend to think about money as something like cash, but if you want to actually go back into the history of it, most of money for all of human history has been debt and credit that's been recorded on ledgers, on tablets, on papyrus that's been circulated in a lot of different ways. And indeed, a lot of the money that exists now, even though, again, if I were to, Google money, the image that would come up would be a pile of cash, is actually, again, ledgers, systems of credit and debt, just that they're electronic now.
Yeah, so I guess when did that transition start to happen? So certainly like a paper ledger at the blacksmith shop is not digital cash in the sense that we now sort of think about it, but the idea of money being ones and zeros in a bank account, credit cards, and other forms of digital cash, how far back does that go?
That goes back quite a ways, actually, like a really surprising length of time. We tend to think about these things as being very recent. We talk about cryptocurrencies as though they like fell out of the cargo bay of a UFO, like all at once, a decade ago. But the history of electronic money, like banks have been on this for decades and decades and decades, right? Like they want to have settlement systems that can work fast, that are reliable. They already had most of their sense of what money is in the form of writing something down in one document and transferring it to another document. So we can see mechanisms ranging from like interbank settlement to cashing checks. A lot of these things have been electronic for a long time, but it was only in the 1970s that people began to realize that this kind of money, electronic money, digital money, ones and zeros, as you say, is going to be everybody's money soon, and that was a major social problem.
So now I think that there's the idea that many hold that cryptocurrency in its current form is completely unique as a phenomenon. And in a sense, I mean, Bitcoin is a relatively new thing specifically, but some of the precedent for Bitcoin-like mechanisms do date back to the 70s, as you're talking about, don't they?
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Partially because people, well, maybe a good way to put this is that when we talk about a technology like Bitcoin, we're actually talking about something that has a couple of different agendas that it's trying to serve. And when we look at where digital cash stuff came from, we basically see those different agendas at work. So the earliest forms of the underlying technologies that eventually fed into Bitcoin were digital cash projects that were just designed to protect privacy. They weren't designed to like create a new form of money. They weren't designed to necessarily let you do all of the groovy new cryptocurrency stuff people do now. Instead, it was just a way to say, I want to exchange money with you. I want to buy something from you. I want to receive a gift from you that will function like cash so that it will create no record of the transaction between us. It will not need to know anything about our identities. It will not enable any form of surveillance or control to happen for that transaction. And so that's what we first see is the idea of digital cash should be a mechanism for protecting privacy.
When I look at the sort of genesis of the earlier forms of digital cash and also more recently the cryptocurrency movement, it seems that there are, maybe this is a little bit too simplistic, but there are sort of two political ideologies that seem to be particularly interested. There's the sort of libertarian side, which is about removing the government as an intermediary, privacy, direct transactions rather than intermediated transactions. And sort of like when you look at Peter Thiel, who was
Mm.
involved with PayPal, who talked about, well, maybe PayPal could even actually develop a currency that is free from government in one sense. That's the libertarian side. I also
Mhm.
see, and I'm curious whether you agree, there's the sort of like techno-utopian side, which is just about, aside from government and privacy and all of these other elements, there's the technology is just going to make everything better side. Question one is, do you agree that those are sort of the two political wings that seem most
Mm.
interested? Number two, are there others, and is there overlap between those two?
Those are excellent questions. Yeah, I think the answer to both is yes. With question one, obviously, one of the most kind of complicated legacies of the way the digital cash came to be that still shapes a lot of aspects of how Bitcoin works, a lot of those technology decisions, and a lot of the kind of culture that still takes place in the cryptocurrency space was this interweaving of the libertarian side and, as you say, like the techno-utopian side. Um, and the libertarian side has its own very specific way of looking at digital cash, which is a view of the world which is deeply suspicious of the notion that the government should have the right to mint money. And that therefore we need alternative currencies that can be as robust and reliable as something issued by a central bank, like with that same level of like, I trust that when I receive this, I know what it is, I can verify that it's real, but with additional elements that are really important to libertarian ideology, like the idea that the currency should function in a way that's more like a precious metal. You know, it should be issued in ways that become steadily more difficult rather than mild inflation to boost the economy. But there's also the techno-utopian side, which is often kind of overlaps with libertarianism, but which has in some ways a deeper attitude, which is what if we could, by changing the way that money works, what if we could unlock extraordinary new levels of innovation? If we could change how markets work, if we could change how the circulation of assets works, what if that could be a spur to a whole new level of investment and invention and transformation and new businesses and new ideas? And as you say, like technology plus money would equal better, to produce the kind of world of breakthroughs that we might be hoping for. So those two are still by far the kind of most significant legacies that shape cryptocurrency. However, there have always been lots of other interested parties who might want to figure out how these things work, and they're more and more coming to the fore and starting to shape some of the future of these technologies. So in particular, we can look at the way that a lot of marginalized groups are very poorly served by the current money system. Whether we look at people who are undocumented and have to live outside of the normal banking apparatus, if we look at people who are in poverty, if we look at people who are on food stamps, like accessing and interacting with cash is very expensive, but it's also extraordinarily difficult unless you're a person above a certain social stratum to get any kind of access to credit or any kind of access to normal banking.
Yes.
Systems that are alternatives for that, just as there's systems that could be alternatives to the incredibly predatory system for sending remittances for workers who are working overseas. Those things are life-changing opportunities, and they have nothing to do with that kind of libertarian, that kind of libertarian techno-utopian legacy. So being able to see how those groups are starting to move in, I think that shows us part of where cryptocurrency is going.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're pointing out is interesting, which is that on the one hand, there are lots of currently underserved populations by the system that we have. At the same time, when you're talking about technology that requires some kind of physical hardware and also sort of like a wherewithal in terms of what your awareness is, I also have concerns that going cashless, at least in the current way that it's happening in many countries, is also not particularly good for some of those underserved populations. So I guess the question is how to implement something like that, a move away from cash that will not particularly hamper those underserved populations that we're sort of trying to help, at least in some circles.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's a really good way of looking at it too, which is that there's a lot of ways in which the transition into a cashless or at least less cashed society could be a disaster, right? Like there's a lot of different ways that could play out. There's many, if you'll forgive me being a little hyperbolic, there's a lot of like hungry wolves out there who have been waiting for the moment when the transaction stream, right? When the data about transactions and payments finally gets folded into all of the other surveillance data. Because the moment you do that, you can start doing all kinds of other things, which are deeply discriminatory and predatory. You can start doing things like, real-time price fixing and redlining. We already see versions of that in our ordinary lives, right? Like you will get different prices for airline tickets based on what the airline server knows about you based on the browser and the computer that you're using, right? If you're like trying to buy these tickets with a browser that carries information on it that suggests that you're using a more expensive computer, you have more money to work with, you're going to get a different price. Imagine that applied more generally to every aspect of our lives. Imagine a system where the payment platform has sweetheart deals with other companies, which when we look at something like Libra, when we look at something like all the various pies that Peter Thiel has his fingers in, would not be a huge surprise. So now imagine the payment platform has sweetheart deals with other companies, and suddenly your money is worth more or less depending on whose products you're buying. You're being like steered in different directions. This is a dystopian future, and it's one that we should bear in mind as the worst possible outcome that could come from the effort that we would make to create new forms of credit and money that were meant to originally help the disadvantaged. So we need to think very carefully about that.
Not to defend airlines, I believe they've denied that that type of information is used to affect pricing. I believe they claim what is obvious, which is that there's a demand-based system which does fluctuate pricing based on how many days until the flight and what time of day and day of the week you are looking. But I believe they have, in the same way that Amazon has, denied that they are using so-called like demographic data. But this certainly the assertion is there, and you have restated it here. When it comes to Bitcoin or some of the other current cryptocurrencies specifically, do these seem like these are going to be the long-term replacements for cash, or do they seem more like intermediate experiments and that the solution is ultimately going to be elsewhere?
That's a really good question. If I were to bet, and I think this is a pretty reasonable bet, I think we're entering an era of much more diverse forms and types of money. I think we're going to see not a sort of one ring to rule them all, single fixed solution that replaces everything. Instead, we're going to see a proliferation of different kinds of vehicles that can range from, well, to put it in actually very straightforward terms we can all relate to, we're already starting to live in that world because we're starting to live in a world that's shaped so much by points, right? Like so many of us are now used to the idea that we have cards or accounts that carry different kinds of value on them, some of which can be redeemed for cash, some of which can be redeemed for miles, some of which can be redeemed for minutes, depending on what country you're in and what circumstances you're under. So what we are already kind of surrounded by is a much more diverse money system that we don't necessarily think of as being diverse than just cash and credit. And that's just going to become much more so. We're going to see a lot more specialized types of money and types of currency for different populations and different groups. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, because I suspect that we will start to understand ourselves as living in an ecosystem of money.
All right, Finn Brunton doing an extremely good job of keeping his cat out of the shot. I can tell during the interview.
It got back into the room. It's like a velociraptor. It's supposed to stay behind the door.
Finn is an associate professor of media, culture, and communication at New York University. Finn, really a pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you so much, David.